For the past few weeks, we've been looking at Old Testament characters. We looked at 3 kings. We got to meet Josiah and Jehoshaphat, and we just met Nebuchadnezzar. We met a guy named Enoch, but today we get to meet a girl, and I'm so excited to introduce you to her. Her name is Rahab. I would love to sit down and have coffee with her, but I don't drink coffee. I would drink coffee to hang out with her, though, because the more I got to know her, I am super excited about who she is, because I have to admit that even though I grew up going to Sunday school, you know, we have little felt stories on the board. Anybody have those? Yes, okay. So you're going to get this. They didn't have felt stories about Rahab, for obvious reasons that I will explain later. And even as an adult, I've done Bible studies, and I never really did one on Rahab. So I got to read about her and all of these things, and I found out that she wasn't just a prostitute. She had a really big part in history of the walls and Jericho, and it's so cool. I can't wait to get going. Okay, so I will tell you, though, I felt a little bit better that even Pastor Rudy didn't know that much about her or Jericho, so that made me feel a little better about, because I felt really bad for only knowing that she was a prostitute when she has this incredible story. So we're going to be looking in Joshua chapter 2. You feel free to look at that in a Bible. There'll be some stuff up on the screen, but I'm just going to tell you the story. Rahab was a young Canaanite prostitute, and she was living near the edge of the city in Jericho. And I tried to see if there was a different way to describe her. Maybe she had a different employment description, and I did see some things that called her an innkeeper, or she ran a tavern. But in verse 1 of Joshua chapter 2, she's called a harlot. And when I looked up harlot, the Hebrew word for harlot, pronounced zana, I'm probably saying that wrong, but zana, means to commit adultery. So she was a prostitute. You can't do anything about it. You can't sugarcoat it. But it encouraged me that as I got to know her, that it's important to know how God saw her and how God uses somebody with not so pretty a past to do some pretty amazing things with her faith and how she acted in that faith. But before we get started on Rahab, I'm going to share just this little video. It kind of gives you a background on what's going on during that time, and it kind of plays a significant role in what's going on. So check out this little video.
The book of Joshua. Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died, and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with 4 main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel.
All right. I love those little videos. They're called the Bible Project. They explain the Bible really well if you ever want to check those out. I feel they're pretty awesome. One thing I do want to clarify, though, is even though it's kind of a cute video and there's happy music, times were really intense then. The Israelites, like I said, had just been on this long journey with God, and they're just on the brink of entering the Promised Land. And they're right outside of Jericho, and that's one of the last big barriers that they need to get over to cross into the promised land. I am not an expert on war or strategies or any of that, although I have watched a ton of movies with my husband on World War II. I think I know more than most girls do about World War II. I'm just saying, y'all. So I had a good enough understanding to get that it was kind of a big deal that Joshua sent these 2 spies in on this reconnaissance mission and how dangerous that was. So we're going to start at Joshua chapter 2 in verse 1, where Joshua has just sent the spies into the city, and they go to Rahab's house. Why Rahab? And why did they go to her house? I don't really know. Her house was located on the edge of the city. I think that made it kind of convenient for people to come in and leave undetected. If you think about what she did, that was probably necessary. So maybe that's why the spies went there, just so it would be easy to sneak into the city that way. And then also keep in mind that the Canaanites, who were this force to be reckoned with, knew who the Israelites were, and they were familiar with who their God was. And even though they lived in this really fortified city of Jericho, they're afraid. So with that, they're under strict surveillance, and they're just because they knew that the Israelites were planning an attack. I'm sorry, I'm going to be choking a lot. Something started grabbing my throat, so sorry. I'm going to pray against that right now. The spies, they end up being spotted, which I don't know if that means they weren't very good spies. I mean, they didn't make it very far. But they're... That sounded bad. Their mission was kind of a bit of a fail. It wasn't very covert. I mean, they don't have the advantage, in all fairness to them. They don't have SEAL team training or CIA skills. I think probably what they needed was Jason Bourne, but he just wasn't around. Oh, get it? He wasn't born yet? I didn't know that at the 8 a.m. Anyway, okay, sorry. They end up being reported to the king in verse 2, and in verse 3, the king of Jericho sent word, or probably more of an order, to Rahab saying, "Bring out the men who came to you to stay the night in your house. They're spies. They've come to spy out the whole country." This is kind of a big deal, and it creates a lot of tension because it's a dangerous situation, not only for the spies, but also for Rahab. I mean, imagine her fear. She's probably already wondering the fate of her city and her people, not to mention herself and her family. And now she has 2 guys in her house that are probably spies, and the king himself has sent these instructions to hand them over. So in that moment, she can either choose to obey the king or not. She chooses to defy the king, and her choice right then becomes a choice of faith. And in spite of that probable fear that she had, she acted in that faith. She hid the spies under some flax that was up drying on her roof. And something interesting that I learned about this flax kind of leads me to believe that she was maybe kind of smart and savvy too, because she made this silk-like linen from the flax, and in order to do that, you have to soak it, which means it's going to get really nasty and slimy, probably smelling, all kinds of things I want nothing to do with. But she hid the spies under that flax, assuming that the soldiers were not going to look there. Can probably assume, too, that maybe that's not the first time she's hid somebody up there, but it works this time for the spies. And then she diverts the soldiers and tells them that, yeah, they've been here, but they're not here anymore. They went this way, so hurry up and go catch them before the gate closes. And at this point, Pastor Rudy and I were really looking at this and trying to figure out, how did all that happen? And who did what when? And what did the king's orders really say? And what was the timeline? And we don't know why any of that happened when it did, or why Rahab chose to protect the spies. I mean, maybe she'd heard the stories about the Israelites from travelers or guests that had come through, or was there more to that letter from the king? We don't know, but what we can assume is that God's Spirit compelled her, and she went against the king's orders and hid the spies and sent those soldiers off on a wild goose chase. But this girl, she didn't even stop there. She goes up to the roof and told Joshua's spies that everyone in the city was afraid and they felt hopeless after hearing all of the things that God had been doing and how faithful he'd been to the Israelites. Do I need that? I guess I need that. Okay, hold please. Now I'm going to be just fine. Thank you, Mark. See, we're a church that serves, y'all. All right. So she knew that God had been faithful to these Israelites going all the way back to the Red Sea, and that was 40 years earlier. So that kind of has an impact on what people are thinking. And also keep in mind that this kind of fear is a big deal because, like I mentioned earlier, the Canaanites, they were not wimps. So things shouldn't be shaking that up. She describes their fear in Joshua at verse 11 and says, "We heard it and our hearts sank. We all had the wind knocked out of us, and all because of you and God, your God, God of the heavens above and God of the earth below." Okay, wait, there's even more. Not only did she explain to the soldiers the state of mind that the city was in, she was about to ask the spies for a promise. In verses 12 and 13, she says, "Now promise me by God, I showed you mercy. Now show my family mercy. Give me some tangible proof, a guarantee of life for my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters, everyone connected with my family. Save our souls." Listen to that part again because you can practically just feel her desperation. Save our souls. I feel like that's probably some foreshadowing, and I'm going to explain that a little bit later, but that took some courage for her. First, I have to think, it's kind of a big deal that she even risked her life to put her trust in these two strangers. And then she asked them to make her a promise. I mean, imagine how many broken promises that this girl has probably experienced just by sheer default of her profession. I know I've had promises broken, and that's a pretty tough thing for me. It will create a chasm between me and whoever broke a promise or broke that trust. It makes it hard for me to trust anybody else. And I think they can leave some pretty deep scars, sometimes even kind of paralyzing. Trust me, I know because I have them. I think a lot of us do. But that didn't seem to impact Rahab. I picture this young, small girl who probably had some deep scars on her heart, yet she made this bold choice just to trust or to have faith in a God that she's most likely only heard stories about. She's probably heard how God protects his people, like I said earlier. She knew that God parted the Red Sea and the Israelites were able to pass through safely. So I think we can assume that God impressed upon her to hide the spies, and any fear that she had of her king lost out to the faith that she was putting in her new king, God. Thankfully, her request was well received, and in the rest of chapter 2, it says that the spies agree as long as she follows some instructions. And they give her a red rope, and I'm going to explain a little something about that, some symbolism on that in just a second. But they give her a red rope, and they tell her to hang it from her window. And they say as long as she and her family stay inside, they'll be safe. But if they go outside, anything that could happen is going to be on them. They go on also to tell her that if she tells anybody that they were there or any agreement that they have, that the agreement is off, and all of that will be on them too. So she sends the spies in the opposite direction that she sent the soldiers and tells them just to hang out for 3 days before going back to your camp, and they do. So they go back to the camp, and then they tell Joshua about the fear that everybody is experiencing. I'm going to pause just for a second about that red rope. So maybe you're already putting it together. That there are some other versions that describe it as a scarlet rope. And either way, that might sound familiar as it kind of echoes Passover and the blood that people were supposed to put, above their doorways to protect them from the angel of death, or Christ's blood and how that stood out against the cross. probably in the same way that that red rope probably stood out quite a bit against the clay of the walls of Jericho. I think each of these symbols leads to being saved from death or even being renewed. And I find things like that fascinating. I geeked out on all kinds of stuff when I was doing this message. But I do believe that God lays out very intentional details for us in his word so that when we pay attention to these things, we not only get to know him better, but it helps strengthen our faith and how we can use our faith. Okay, so getting back to Rahab. I also have to wonder, how safe would I feel depending on some little red rope hanging out of my window against these huge walls? Because these walls were kind of a big deal. So I have a little illustration here of them. But I've seen descriptions that say they're basically about 20 to 30 feet deep. And then they had 2 levels. So the first level was about 20 feet high. And then there's this embankment that builds up. And then that second section of wall is at least 30 feet high. So it was quite the fortress. And from what I understand, it was pretty impenetrable. And that the citizens could be in there for a really long time and just not have to worry. Think about it as an ultimate zombie apocalypse shelter. That's kind of the impression I got when I was reading it. My kid would be so proud of me for saying that, right, Connor? You weren't listening to me right then. You were talking? Okay. Anyway, the next part of the story is found in Joshua 6, and it tells how these incredible walls just crumble after Joshua and his army follow God's explicit instructions. The nutshell on that is Joshua was to have his army march around the city once a day for 6 days and just wait in silence, so not saying a word. Everybody was just to silently wait on God or faithfully wait on God. And I think it's kind of interesting to note that it was really both sides waiting on God. So the Israelites are trusting and waiting for God's instructions, and some commentaries even say that the Canaanites were waiting, and they had an opportunity to change their hearts and follow God, but they didn't. But Rahab did. The next part, maybe you guys are already familiar with. On the 7th day, Joshua had the army march around the city 7 times, and 7 priests were playing their trumpets. And then at a certain point, the army just starts shouting, and then the walls just crumble. They just completely collapse. And I think that's pretty amazing because the part that didn't collapse was the part where the red rope was hanging by Rahab's house. I still can't imagine being Rahab for that week. Can you imagine just being in, I'm imagining it was probably small, and I don't know how many people were in her family. They were pretty big back then. So you're just sitting in there, and there's this tension of, an army marching around. What are you thinking at that point? What are they waiting for? Does her family think she's crazy? I don't know, but here's just the thing. I think this was probably not only shocking for Rahab, but for the Israelites and even the Canaanites, just to see everything collapse except for that part around Rahab's house. What an amazing lesson in faith that had to have been. And for Rahab, it seemed like she had some choices. She could have obeyed the king. She could have turned those spies over to the soldiers. She could have even told the soldiers where she sent the spies after she sent them, but she didn't. Rahab's courage and her faith in the Lord saved her. It saved her family, and it saved generations to come. Get this. She ends up marrying, and then she has a son named Boaz. Boaz married Ruth. Maybe you've heard that story. If you haven't, now you need to check it out because this brings a whole new meaning to it, and I don't have time that I get to tell you about that. But I'd be happy to share it with you afterwards because I'm so excited about it. But through Rahab, and then Boaz and Ruth, you can trace that lineage to David all the way to Jesus, and then us. Isn't that amazing? I got super excited when I read that. But Rahab had faith, and she acted in it, just like we should. And I know that this is a controversial topic when it comes to faith and works, but in this case, James 2:24 and 25 says, "So you see, We are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. Rahab the prostitute is another example. She was shown to be right with God by her actions when she hid those messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. Look at that last phrase. She sent them safely away by a different road. When you look at that, and if you think about it, she literally sent them on a different road that led to their salvation. And not just their salvation, but the salvation of generations to come, and they're still coming. Their souls were saved from death, just like she asked for her own soul to be saved from death back in verse 13. That is really not unlike our own journey to salvation. We only have one way to it, and that's through Jesus. And it doesn't matter what the world says. Acts 4:12 says, there is salvation in no one else. God has given no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. So we are called to set people on the path to salvation. That's our role. And sometimes, like in the case of Rahab, it can be risky. And because of that, I think we let things get in the way of those necessary risks. I know I do. I want to have that faith like Rahab, where I take the risk. Because I know that I have faith. There's no doubt that I have faith. And I'll talk freely about my faith. But I have to wonder, how many opportunities have I missed when it comes to stepping out in my faith to reach out to someone? I can think of one of those moments. It was about probably 15 years ago. We'd moved to Hillsboro, and one of our staircases didn't have a railing. That was kind of important because we had 3 little kids. And if you know my kids, I needed that staircase. So we hired a carpenter to come in and build the staircase, and it took a while because there was a lot of detail work to do. So I got to spend a lot of time with this carpenter and enough time to figure out pretty early on he was certifiably crazy. It actually made me a little nervous, so I'd kind of avoid him, but I felt this nudge to invite him to Easter, or at least ask if he had a church to go to. But I didn't on that day, I didn't. And he came back the next day, and I felt it, and I still ignored it. I think I justified it by thinking I needed to keep, I think Madeline was up playing with his tools or something, a bad mom fail on my part. But anyway, I'm like, oh, no, I kept everybody away, and I did not invite him. He left some things at our house. He never came back for them. I've never seen him again, and I don't know what happened. All I know is that I ignored that nudge, and I have to trust that somebody else stepped in if that was needed, because I didn't. And I just have to wonder, why don't I do that? Why do I do things like that? Sometimes you might see somebody who, you're just walking down the street and they're visibly upset or even crying. And you kind of feel like, oh, I want to go see what's wrong. But I don't. And I feel like I should. So instead, what do? I just say a little prayer. It's like I'm telling God, I'm just going to do it this way instead. That'll be okay. That's not okay. That's not okay. It leaves this feeling of just feeling really unresolved. And for me, I carry those around for a while. And like I said, I just have to trust that somebody else steps up when I don't. And hopefully I'm going to start stepping up more. It makes me think, how did that go down for Rahab? I mean, did she hear God's voice? Was she a woman? She was somebody that we consider to have a checkered past. But if she had the courage and the faith to defy her king and trust that God was going to save her and her family, why can't I do that just when I go to talk to a person? But she trusted these spies, and she trusted their instructions to hang that red rope and just wait. And the rest is history. Continues to be history in the making. Makes me wonder what that's going to be for us. But now that I've told you this, what I think to be a beautiful story about Rahab, you might be wondering why. But it's because I think her story is the perfect example of something that I like to call flinchless faith. I love that phrase. I'm pretty sure I couldn't say it 3 times. I can barely say it once. I can't kid that. I was tripping all over it, but I can't even take credit for it. I just heard it somewhere a long time ago, and it really stuck with me because I want my faith to be like that. James 2:19 says that even the demons have faith. So I would hate to think that my kind of faith couldn't be differentiated from a demon, because it's not just about having faith, it's what we do with our faith. So in thinking about Rahab and her story, I would like to share 3 things that we can keep in mind as I wrap this up. The first is, when it comes to our own faith, are we in a place of being self-serving or self-sacrificing? Are we willing to take risks or to step out of a comfort zone? Are we willing to die to self? That means, are we more concerned with our own selves and our security, or are we willing to put ourselves on the line? Rahab's faith resulted in salvation, and not just hers. If you think about it, her lineage is leading all the way up to Jesus, and that resulted in her being, I get excited about that, sorry. She's in the hall of faith. So I just think that's amazing, and that is a salvation that is available to anyone who will freely receive it. She had a flinchless faith. She risked her life. It's hard. I know. I hesitate at a lot of things, and sometimes it's out of insecurity or fear, or maybe I worry that I'm not worthy enough or that I'm qualified enough. Sometimes it might just be a matter of inconvenience. If I'm really being honest, sometimes I don't even know why. Why didn't I invite our carpenter to Easter? I don't know. And why don't I talk to a stranger who looks like they're struggling? I would want somebody to do that for me or for my daughter. If my daughter were, wouldn't you want that? And none of these things are pretty to carry around. They hurt my heart, and I know that it's not honoring to God. He honors when we act out in our faith. It's laying down our lives for the sake of others. That's when we are like Jesus. He gave up his life for us, and we have that same power through the Holy Spirit, and it gives us the strength and the boldness that we need in order to do that, which brings me to my second point. We get to be a part of God's redemptive story. We're already a part of it. You are, I am, Rahab was. It's just, where are we going to step into that story? And that goes back to the difference between having faith and acting in it. It's more than just the idea of serving God or following him. It means that we get to partner with him in furthering his kingdom, and which I think that sounds amazing. If you think about that for just a second, there are a lot of things that we can be a partner of. When my son Ian worked for Starbucks, he was called a partner, not just an employee, because I think that gives a sense of ownership, or at the very least, of belonging, and to say that I or we get to partner with God in building his kingdom. That makes me go, ah. It's more exciting than Christmas coming, Jason. So, God already has the story written, and he knits together some beautiful stories, just like Rahab's, that ultimately wrote her into the Hall of Faith that I was just saying, and she's one of only 2 women that are listed there. And now we get the choice of being a part of it, and we're going to be rewarded, but we're also going to be held accountable. So what is it that gets in the way? That's going to bring me to my last point, and that's kind of a tough one for us because there's not a lot we can really do about it because we live here. We cannot listen to the world. It is filled with so much negativity. We hear it from the media. We hear it from people. We hear it from ourselves. We hear it from an enemy. And trust me, that enemy, he's not going to stop at anything to prevent us from furthering God's kingdom, even if it's at our own expense. So we can't listen. 2 Corinthians 5:17 promises us that we get a new start, a new life. This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone. A new life has begun. So we need to let God's voice drown out all of those lies, and just remember that no matter what our past choices were, they don't get to own us or disqualify us. We aren't that powerful. Jesus dying on the cross, that overcame anything and anything that we have ever done. and it overcame everything for us. We are new creations, and we get to be used in God's story. We get to partner with him. He used Rahab and her past. She was a hooker. I have to say it, sorry. That's what she was. That's probably how the spies ended up at her house in the first place, right? I have to tell you, while I was typing this, I kept typing Rahab, and it kept auto-correcting to Rehab, and I was getting really annoyed because I'm like, oh. But I thought about it for a second, and I'm like, you know what? That's kind of true. God rehabilitated Rahab. He didn't change who she was and then use her. He used her as she was, and he can use us too. Look at it like this. It's not who we were. It's who we are and who we are becoming. And I'm going to say that again because I have to say it to my own self a lot. And I just want to engrave it in my head. It's not who we were. It's who we are and who we are becoming. And here's why it is so important that we get this, because it's a matter of life and death. Our culture, our political climate, it's really not all that different than Rahab's. It's not in a good place. Or even if we just look at our own individual worlds, we live in a me culture. Pastor Rudy was just talking about that when he was talking about narcissism and building our own personal kingdoms. So you can think about your workplace or where you socialize, maybe your school, your family. What do I mean by that? I mean, in any given situation, whether it's at work or school or in relationships or a family dinner, maybe just standing in your own driveway, just any isolated moment, we have a choice. And sometimes that choice might be a risk. We could end up losing our job. Maybe we lose a friend. Maybe you just risk being uncomfortable or really embarrassed. But acting in our faith, being bold in our faith, ultimately that means we are not going to fail, because I completely trust that God is not going to leave us hanging when we listen to his subtle, or not so subtle, nudges. I don't know about you, but when I think about that and the trust that I have in that and the promise that is in that, it makes me really motivated to want to go out and look for those moments. I mean, how do I get to step into the story? So I'm just going to recap that really quick because I think I just said a lot of words. We need to decide, are we going to be self-serving or self-sacrificing? We need to realize that we get to be a part of God's redemptive story, just like Rahab. And we need to guard our hearts by not listening to the world, because ultimately it is not who we were, it's who we are and who we are in Jesus and who we become through his power. It's not about whether or not we think we're capable or worthy, it's about being willing. Am I willing to risk being awkward or uncomfortable? Am I willing to trust God? Are we willing to step out from behind those walls and allow God to tear them down? Those walls of Jericho, those walls fell by faith, and those were some big walls. I am a self-proclaimed creature of habit. Ask anybody, comfort, habit too. I am a habit girl, but I am a self-complete, now I can't say it at all. I like to be comfortable. Ask my family. I have cozy blankets. I like the fireplace on. I also have a lot of insecurity. So I think my short answer, while it might not be no on whether I'm willing to step out, it's not really a fast yes either. But I want to have that faith of Rahab. She acted in her faith. She had to wait for what probably felt like 7 very long days, but God met her there. Her past didn't impact his love for her or his provision for her. And I trust that God won't just meet us where we are. I think he's right there waiting for us. I know he's right there. And I'm trying to remember to pray and ask God not only to put those opportunities in front of me, but that I'm going to have the courage to act in those moments. So I'm going to encourage you to do the same, because God is faithful and he's going to answer. So I'm going to pray for a Flinchless. See, I can't even say it once. Flinchless faith. I'm going to pray that for all of us right now. God, you are an amazing God. Thank you for being a God that we can have faith in. Thank you for Rahab. Thank you for the gift of your salvation. You didn't create a life that you don't intend to use, no matter who we were. We're all broken. We all have our broken places. I know I do. But you see our weaknesses as our potential strength. And I want to pray that we can all have the kind of faith that inspires us to partner with you in building your kingdom. I want to pray against any unspoken feelings that are not aligned with you. I pray that you will instill the confidence in us to break down those barriers or the walls that prevent us from doing just that. And when you put opportunity in front of us, I pray for a flinchless faith for each and every one of us. I know it's in us. I'm just praying that it's activated. You are the author of many incredible stories with more to come. And I can't wait to see where we get to step into your story. With you, I know it's going to be a beautiful blessing. We love you. Amen.